New Orleans, 1920. America's second largest port is America's #1 party city. In this brawling place, where blacks, French Cajun, Spanish, American, Europeans, and Chinese live, work, and play, a new music emerges out of the constant clash and commotion of culture. The music is jazz. Marijuana and jazz go together like a melody and lyrics. Where jazz goes, reefers follow. But there's another reason for its widespread use. In 1920, it is the only legal drug in town. Even here, where everything the flesh desires can be had, prohibition keeps the flow of liquor out of sight. The choice of a new intoxicant becomes the perfectly legal weed, shipped in from the Caribbean, Mexico, and South America, and sold like cigarettes in jazz clubs, markets, and pharmacies. It is cheap and popular. But even in paradise, there's trouble. New Orleans is in the midst of a crime wave. Murder dominates the headlines and attracts William Randolph Hearst's attention, eager for a sensational story to sell.
New Orleans was a sort of a source, the beginning of concern about marijuana. They saw it as linked to crime, violent crime, or even predatory crime. Also, sometimes it seemed to be related to murders, to rape, and so on.
Hearst coins the phrase marijuana menace and prints lurid tales about the drug's capacity to cause rape, murder, and mayhem. Just as reports of cocaine-crazed Negroes a decade ago had stirred lawmakers to ban cocaine, headlines and stories of the marijuana menace were affecting cannabis the same way.
Society worries about its members who are not in control of their mind. So in order to prevent chaos in society, limit the use of the product or the thing that's inducing those kinds of effects.
State lawmakers were quick to ban a drug that they identified with black violence. In 1924, Louisiana joins 14 other states banning the distribution of marijuana for non-medical purposes.
And it gets back to the scapegoat. So you can scapegoat different racial groups, you can scapegoat the lower classes, you can use the drug to do the scapegoating for you. You can attack them because they're using the drug.
Slowly and surely, it will be banned across the country, state by state, for one reason or another. In the Southwest, the reason for a ban on pot was economics and prejudice.
They were worried about all these Mexicans down on the Texas border who were, it was the depths of the Depression. And these Mexicans had been a very useful labor force in the 20s when we needed them, but now it's the Depression, you got all these gringos in the bread line. You sure as hell don't need all these Mexicans. So how could we stigmatize them and get rid of this cheap labor force and get them out of here?
According to the San Antonio Gazette, quote, "The men who smoke this herb become excited to such an extent that they go through periods of near frenzy and worse. It is always aggressive as the crimes which have been committed in garrisons, armories, barracks, and the humble suburbs of Mexico." In 1931, Mexican repatriation becomes law. Mexicans who don't go quietly are subject to varying forms and degrees of harassment. Many are charged with vagrancy. Others are arrested for violation of new state marijuana laws that are often an excuse to drive Mexicans out of the country.
So in Texas, for example, if you got caught with one joint, you could get sent to jail for life. In fact, there were campaigns in some of the states for the death penalty. And there are cases of people serving many years, decades, in jails for possession.
Except for a handful of states in the Southwest, marijuana is still legal in the United States. But that will change soon after Harry J. Anslinger, the nation's top drug enforcement agent, takes office at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. But first, Anslinger must convince Congress to do something it has never done before: outlaw a weed. His chief tactic is to convince Congress and the public that a weed is the cause of sex and murder. A message that scares an already fearful Depression-era America.
I had to kill him. Before they killed me! I had to kill him! Can't you understand? I had to kill him! They kill me unless I kill them! Can't you understand?
1930, the gaiety of marijuana collides with a nation in despair. Across the United States, the Great Depression has brought joblessness, red lines, and above all, fear to America.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
But the nation's fear is not just economic. There are fears of crime and gangsters, unions and communists, immigrants, and even alcohol. Since 1920, alcohol has been banned by a constitutional amendment. But after 14 years, the law is repealed. The government now focuses on narcotics under a new federal bureau.
The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was unprecedented in that it was the sole autonomous bureau charged with enforcing narcotics legislation in 1930.
It is headed by a 38-year-old Harry J. Anslinger.
He had had no particular experience with drugs, but he came in, and what he was a complete bureaucrat. That is, he wanted to protect his agency. He wanted to keep his budget going.
To Anslinger, there is nothing glamorous about fighting drugs, but soon he sees that it is one of the most important issues of his time, endorsed by some of the country's most powerful men, like publisher William Randolph Hearst.
Anslinger went to visit Hearst at San Simeon Castle. I guess it was one time. And Hearst told him that he personally wrote all of the anti-drug editorials in the Hearst newspapers. And I think that Anslinger himself felt that this was a kind of a disgusting subject, like maybe being commissioner of garbage or something like this. And he was just astounded that anyone would, who's really important, would care about it.
The Bureau's efforts have been aimed at fighting heroin and cocaine. But with Anslinger's arrival in 1930, marijuana is the new drug problem born out of the trouble in the Southwest with Mexican migrant workers. Anslinger's first battle with marijuana is over who will police it. There are no federal laws against the drug, and he wants to keep it that way, leaving the states to control it, not the federal government.
He had tried to get the states to adopt a uniform narcotic law, which would include cannabis, and that would allow each state to decide how much of its resources it wanted to put out for the control of marijuana or cannabis, and it wouldn't touch his budget or his agents. That had some success, but not complete. There was continued pressure on the government in Washington to do something about these Mexican immigrants who smoked marijuana and went into town on the weekends and created havoc.
Texas, California, Arizona, and Colorado insist it's the federal government's responsibility to do something, but Anslinger resists. He has no interest in staking a career on combating a weed. He has only a staff of 300 and a $1.5 million budget to battle drugs the world over. He wants to avoid a law that will be difficult to enforce and offers a different approach.
He wanted silence. If you had to say something, you made it sound as awful as possible.
And I say marijuana is a killer drug.
But by and large, there was nothing they could do about it. There was no real big action. They didn't have the funding. They didn't have the people. And I remember he said to me once, I was driving around the upper Potomac, and I was crossing the bridge, and I just parked on the bridge, and I got out and I looked, and there was marijuana plants as far as you could see. And he said, I said to myself, and they want me to wipe this out.
Anslinger can do nothing to stop the push from states of the Southwest for a federal law against marijuana. The issue is less about the dangers of the drugs and more about politics. Marijuana is entangled in immigration problems.
I remember when